Okay, thank you. Welcome to this breakout session. I'm delighted to see everybody here, and I am personally really interested to hear what our panel has to say. The panel is, it's a really exciting opportunity to see some of the leaders, some of the thought leaders in the NGO space here today. So we have Mindy Lubber, who is the CEO and president of the sustainable nonprofit Ceres. Ceres works with capital market leaders and businesses to set sustainability agendas. Richard Newell is the president of Resources for the Future, president and CEO, I should say, of Resources for the Future, an independent nonprofit research firm that works on environmental, energy, and natural resources policy. Vicki Patton is general counsel of Environmental Defense Fund, and at EDF she leads the U.S. Legal and Regulatory Program. And John Kreitz is the CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI. He's an internationally recognized leader on global energy issues and climate change. RMI works with businesses, communities, governments, and other NGOs to accelerate and scale solutions that drive cost-effective shift from fossil fuels to renewables. So let me just give you a little bit of framing. The framing builds on some of the remarks that I made today. I'm Jim Stock, Vice Provost for Climate Sustainability and Director of the Salata Institute, and an economist and a policy wonk, which is why I'm really excited to do this. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of my framing, and of course the panel should be welcome to disagree with my framing, but I think that it's going to be more interesting just to hear what they have to say. The last couple of years have really seen a remarkable transformation in and this is a U.S.-focused panel, and my remarks are going to be U.S. policy-focused. The last couple of years have seen a remarkable transformation in U.S. climate policy, just an explosion, but also what we might think of as the culmination of perhaps a decade or even more than a decade's policy agenda. So that's certainly starts with extending the tax credits and then enhancing very substantially those tax credits in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, does much more than that, so there's an additional stream of policy drive over the last decade to support nascent technologies, and that comes out in full force in the context not just of CCUSS credits, really carbon capture credits really ramped up, but hydrogen and lots of other initiatives that are living within the IRA and also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So those are all really significant steps forward. At the same time, on the regulatory agenda, there's been a substantial motion taken by EPA recently. Well, there's the methane rule, but then more recently there's the tailpipe rule, which is a quite aggressive stage setting for supporting zero emissions vehicles going forward, and that was the proposed rule was just released a few weeks ago. We're expecting any moment the power plant rule to drop. Both of those are building on, well, we don't know about the power plant rule, but we expect that it, like the tailpipe rule, will be building on a lot of the incentives that are built into the IRA. So what we're seeing, and there's more to it, so what we're really seeing is a culmination of Clean Air Act authority that's actually being implemented and being taken to implementation, seeing substantial tax incentives, including for new technologies being driven through the tax code. And as I say, this is really a culmination of a lot of the agenda for the last decade, which really puts us at a point now. If you then think about that graph that I put up this morning, you say, that's fantastic, that's really great, oh boy, what's the next step? And so that is the question that I'm just going to put to the panelists. And what I've asked them to do is just prepare a few minutes, not too many minutes, but a few minutes of comments to that question, and then we'll just engage in some discussion and then open it to floor questions. Mindy?
Sure, and I'm going to speed talk perhaps. The first issue is, as we move to a net zero future, there's a lot going on, much going on in the economy. We're working with hundreds of companies, hundreds of investors who are striving to get there. But we need to always remember that there are thousands behind them. And it may be the Fortune 500 companies, large pension funds could act. But in the end, you need policy. Policy that will level the playing field, will require everybody to act in a uniform, similar way, and frankly, allow us to act at a pace and scale that we require. We can no longer, if we're going to get to half of where we need to go, half of getting to 1.5 by 2030, that will not happen company by company, investor by investor, consumer by consumer. So how do we make that transformation? And it has to be nothing short of transformational. There is just no more room for piece by piece by piece. We are out of time. Pace and scale matter. So when you think about what we've done recently, and then I'll just talk a little bit about what more we need to do, but $369 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act. That is enough to start getting us to a transformed electric economy, transportation economy, jobs development, jobs training. But I will say to you, as a former federal government employee or running the EPA regional office as a regulator, government doesn't necessarily move fast enough. It is incumbent upon every one of us. If we want that $369 billion and the $2.5 trillion with a T dollars from the Infrastructure Act to happen and to make a difference, we need to act now. It means commenting on things like IRS rules that not everybody knows about, but we got to learn about it quickly. I've got a lot of lawyers, a lot of regulators. None of us know tax law. We are learning it. We are bringing people in. This bill is about carrots, not sticks. It is about jobs. It is about the economy. It is about 40% of it going to communities of color or communities that have been impacted. It is worth us putting everything behind it. Between that and the infrastructure bill, shame on us if it doesn't happen. But let me assure you, it will not happen without our engagement. A couple of other things that matter. Procurement. The administration, by administrative order, not by statutory change, has said that everything that the government procures, new refrigerators for cafeterias, new cars, everything has to match a standard related to climate. That too will be fought, it'll be litigated. We need to make sure that those things happen and happen now and not in the future. And then I'll say one or two others. I know Vicki will talk about some of the EPA regs that are so important, and she's been so essential, and we've certainly supported them. But federal financial agencies have a role, and that's where people from Harvard Business School and others. The SEC a year ago, or 9.5 months ago, put out a 507-page draft rule just calling for mandatory climate risk disclosure. Not bring your footprint down, not do cartwheels, not do anything else, but disclose that financial material risk. 507-page rule, I would argue it was quite strong. They've had 16,914 comments, many of them against it, more comments than any rule, including Dodd-Frank. And that is getting slowed down. We live in a moment in time where even the obvious and the simple, and it's happening around the world, mandatory disclosure. And why would a company not want equal playing fields in the U.S. and elsewhere? So there's federal financial regulatory items in addition to what the Energy Department could do and what the EPA might do that we all need to be looking at. Is the Federal Reserve supervising, stress testing banks on their climate risk, given the financial implications? Our studies would say no. We have meetings with the Fed every day. The opportunities are clear, although I will say just if we make sure what has already passed, it could be transformative. Think about it, and then I will stop. The infrastructure, trillions of dollars. For years we've been saying, how do we get to cement and steel that are less polluting, less greenhouse gas emitting? We have the option now. If we're going to ever transform that industry, now is the time. If we look back 10 years from now or 5 years from now and have not taken full advantage of the infrastructure law, of the IRA, shame on all of us. And my final word is it will not happen without pressure from businesses, from academia, from investors, from citizens. The federal government is not equipped to move at the pace and the scale with pushing, with concern. It will happen. But that's on all of us. And we've got the opportunity. We've got the glide path. we've got the tools. We now need to make them happen, and I look forward to working with all of you to make them happen.
Thanks so much. Richard.
Thanks, Jim, and it's great to be back here. I did my PhD at the Kennedy School in environmental policies, so really pleased to be here talking about climate in specific. So when I think about the need for additional policy action, first question is, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And as Jim correctly pointed out, what we need to do is drive the whole economy to net zero emissions. If we don't do that, we're not going to stabilize the climate. It's pretty much that simple. We could have debates about how fast, what time frame, but regardless of what time frame you put on it, we need to drive the economy to net zero emissions. Otherwise, we'll never stabilize the climate. So that's the problem. So then where are the emissions? Which is very important to think about from a policy point of view. So in the United States, we're still 80% fossil fueled in the United States, just as a kind of benchmark. Same thing is true globally. That's still the current situation. 28% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from the transportation sector, 25% are from the power sector, 23% are from industry like aluminum, iron, steel, cement, petrochemicals. 13% are direct energy use in buildings for like heating and cooling and cooking. And then 10% are from agriculture, right? So it's spread around. It's not a single sector. It's very different from other environmental problems in that regard, and so that increases the complexity of the problem. Okay, so how do you go this? In the United States, we've taken an approach which is pretty much a sector-by-sector approach. There were various attempts at doing something economy-wide. Some regions of the country have done that. Some other regions of the world have done that. That's not the approach the United States has taken. And one of the reasons I want to point this out is that there has been a lot of focus on the power sector for good reasons. The power sector is kind of a linchpin. If you want to decarbonize the economy, you need to decarbonize the power sector because then you can electrify other places and get those decarbonized as well. But it's 25% of our emissions, so it's important also not to lose sight of the other sectors. And I'll come back in a second to say a little bit more about those other sectors. So that's where the emissions are. So what policy we currently have, I think we've already heard the list of policy. We have the Infrastructure Act. We have the Inflation Reduction Act. We have the CHIPS and Science Act. We have proposed rules on methane for oil and gas, for transportation, light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles, and soon in the power sector. So that's what's already in place. But that's not everything. So what do we need to do in the near term? And I would define near term over the next year. One is to write the regulations that actually implement the Inflation Reduction Act. Passing the law isn't the end of the story. There's a lot of, varies, provision by provision, but there's a number of very important provisions, and how those regulations get written is going to be very impactful in terms of the incentives it provides, not only to deploy technology, but to do it in a way that actually reduces emissions. Also, the rules that have been proposed are not final, okay? And that needs to be done in the next year. Otherwise, there's a potential for, and I don't know if Vicki will speak to this, something called the Congressional Review Act, which is, depending on where the next administration and the next Congress goes, could be overturned unless that's done in the next year. So that's kind of the near-term work. Longer-term work. One is to actually make the incentives that are in place in the Inflation Reduction Act have impact on the ground, which means building things and building a huge amount of infrastructure, new power, new manufacturing facilities, and so on. And so a critical element of that is permitting reform, siting permitting reform, also around transmission. So maybe we'll come back to that and talk about that further. That's a very important live set of debate and discussion. There's a Republican bill out there. There's a couple different Democrat bills, one by Manchin, one by the more kind of environmental progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So that's out there. Then there's industrial emissions. Industrial emissions, we really don't have much in the way of policy around industrial greenhouse gas emissions right now. We have some incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act for hydrogen, for CCUS, but there's nothing really mandating or requiring or putting specific performance metrics on the industrial sector, which is 23% of our emissions, and by the end of the decade, it'll probably be the biggest source of emissions as we decarbonize the other sectors, right? Their trade becomes a critically important issue. So how we think about the nexus of domestic climate action and international trade for these trade-exposed, energy-intensive sectors, where we don't want to just allow our action to kind of leak through manufacturing going across our border. So that's a very important, and that'll take legislative action to really confront that. Finally, I'll just close by saying there's going to be a number of different, what I would call kind of knock-on effects of climate action. As we stop using gasoline to power vehicles, we need to replace the tax revenue from gasoline taxes, which is our major source of funding. In fact, we have $140 billion a year of revenue for federal, state, local government that is from fossil fuels. So we need to get about the business of figuring out how to replace that revenue. And there's a number of other examples of that, doing the transition in a way that is just and equitable. We need to really pay attention, to decarbonize the economy really touches all aspects of the economy. And so, the number of different additional policy actions that we're needing to be taken, over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30 years. This is, I don't think the end of the road, Jim. One of your questions I think you had to us in advance is like, what's going to keep us busy? I think we're going to be busy with this for quite a while. It's great that we've gotten going, but there's a lot of important work to be done.
Thanks, Vicki.
The only way we're going to get to net zero, and that is where we need to get, is if climate action benefits people's lives. And the opportunity that the Inflation Reduction Act provides is an opportunity to take climate action over the next 10 years. And it is a 10-year historic investment that, with the stroke of the pen, change the economics of clean energy forever. And the only way we're going to maximize that 10 years and maximize that impact and be on the pathway to net zero is if that law, those words on paper over the next 10 years, are translated in a way that benefits people's lives. So that means that we've got to create shared economic prosperity. And right now, it has unleashed $120 billion of investments in electric vehicle side of the equation alone. We are experiencing in our country for the first time in generations a manufacturing renaissance. And the good news is that it is happening in Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio and in Michigan, and communities who have been left behind for far too long are seeing for the first time glimmers of hope and economic opportunity. We need more of that, and we need all of you to help get there. The other way it helps benefits people's lives is in my home state of Colorado, when the local electricity provider, Xcel Energy, negotiated a long-term contract with the steel mill in Pueblo, Colorado. So that steel mill was facing increasing energy costs due to the coal plant. It was purchasing coal-based power. And what they realized, with the tax credits that are now reflected into law for 10 years, that they could negotiate a long-term contract and they could keep 1,000 steel mill employees in Pueblo, Colorado. This is the single largest consumer of electricity in the state of Colorado. They transitioned to utility-scale solar and storage from coal. They saved money over a long-term contract, and they kept 1,000 manufacturing jobs in a community that would have been distressed and left behind but for that economic opportunity. We also need to ensure that this law is implemented. These words on paper become real-world benefits in people's lives by addressing the racial inequities, the systemic inequities, and the communities that have been bearing the heavy burden of pollution for far too long are the beneficiaries of clean solutions that provide a better, brighter, healthier future. The other tremendous opportunity we have in translating these words on paper into real-world action is to give our country not only sort of real-world benefits and economic opportunity that benefits people's lives, but to translate that from global tensions, and there's been a lot of conversation about the global tensions that the Inflation Reduction Act has created, to global opportunities. We are driving up the learning curves with these investments if we get it right, and driving down the costs. And if we can drive down the costs globally, then we can help that will have tremendous global benefits, and it will change the conversation from one of global tensions to one of global opportunities. It also means that for the first time in a generation, the United States can be a global partner at the global table with real credibility, right? We are delivering real-world progress on climate change. We have, for the first time in a generation, real credibility. But it all comes down to what we do in the next 10 years and how we implement this law and whether it benefits people's lives, whether it is lasting and it builds climate power and climate momentum. We also need people. To be able to sort of make the progress to net zero, we need engineers, we need electricians, we need people to install solar panels. We need to think about the community college in northeastern Colorado, where it is the best place in the world to get trained as a wind technician turbine, and we need to have those opportunities in communities all across our country. We need people who are at the cutting edge of business and finance and farming and agricultural innovation. And all of those opportunities are reflected in this law, and if we work together and we build that capacity, we can maximize its impact. We also need innovation. The ideas that are reflected in the Inflation Reduction Act were incubated years and years ago. They were forged by people like Mindy, working over years and years and years to come up with new ideas that could be reflected into national scale progress. Those ideas do not come from Washington, D.C. Those ideas come from all parts of our country. They come from the private sector. They come from General Motors making a commitment to say we are going to eliminate tailpipe emissions from all of our new light-duty vehicles by 2035 and changing the conversation. They come from the state of Colorado adopting the first ever limits on oil and gas methane. That happened years and years ago, and that became the basis for national scale progress and then global progress. When President Biden landed in Glasgow and said, we have not only a national scale commitment to tackle methane, one of the single biggest contributors to methane pollution, but we also, to global warming, to climate warming, but we also have a global commitment, a global methane initiative. So what we need is the innovation now incubated by these investments and this opportunity so that 5, 10 years from now, as we're building momentum, building support for climate action, we have the very best ideas we can for the next step and the next generation of progress, and that starts here.
John.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Vicki. A number of things I would build on there, but first, that this transition is about economics in the end. And, you know, there's a wonderful quote from Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, where one character asks another, so how did you go bankrupt, right? And the second responds, gradually, then suddenly, right? And we're at that gradually to suddenly moment in the energy transition right now, where solar is the cheapest form of new energy for 95% of the people on this planet. It'll get to 100% soon. It'll then be the cheapest form of marginal energy and start displacing other forms of energy at scale. That makes things like hydrogen and heat pumps. It makes things like storage and electrification of vehicles and all the different ways that we can transition much cheaper, much more affordable, much more accessible and equitable to everyone globally. You know, what we have in the Inflation Reduction Act is a massive investment to pull the future forward by more than a decade here, to help bring not just solar and wind closer to full economic parity in all senses, but also many other technologies in the process. Now, to Mindy's point, we're not going to get there, right, without actually stewarding this money through, because simply dumping incentives, and there are sizable incentives here, and RMI has gone through and calculated state by state, you know, billions of dollars, $32 billion for Louisiana, $28 billion for Michigan, et cetera, that are there to be claimed in the end, but it doesn't just naturally happen, right? We actually need to steward through the process of helping communities gain access to the funds that help retrofit their buildings. We need to sit in the middle of complex networks of corporations that are dependent upon public infrastructure, that are looking to build out and finance new hydrogen facilities, new low-carbon corridors, new ammonia plants, et cetera, that all are going to depend upon having the ability to work together at scale in ways that don't naturally happen in very short periods of time. And so that's what, you know, in part my institution does alongside all of our friends here at the table, is we help to take that public infrastructure, this incentive that we have, this once in a generation, absolutely essential imperative win that we must take in the end. We work within kind of constituents to help that move faster. Now, as we think about the legislative agenda going forward, I think that was our big chance, right? That is our big chance. From an RMI perspective, there may be some additional work that we do on permitting and siting reform. There are divergent views right now on how exactly to approach that, and it's going to be tough to get a big legislative win on that front. We do see, very clear regulatory pushes at the national level, and as Richard mentioned, certainly clean power front and center, vehicles front and center. But for us, if it comes down to implementation, it's about subnational policy. It's about building the constituents, the capabilities at the local and regional levels that actually take these national incentives and move them forward with local diligence, harnessing and creating the equity and outcomes that are required, the jobs that are required at the local level. Now, already, the IRA has been a huge success, right? When we look at it, there are about $250 billion with a B that have already been of new projects that have already been cited, 3-to-1 right now in red states versus blue states. When we think about that, over 100,000 jobs that are queued up that are created in the process of these deployments. Now, we need to move at a much larger scale here, but we're seeing appreciable momentum again. We can come back to many other points here along the way, but I would note, bottlenecks on workforce, bottlenecks on just getting corporate mobilization fast enough in the time frame that we have, because we're working with a very short fuse here. We have the politicization and congressional attacks that are underway that we need to be conscious of. And, in the end, our ability to move quickly does depend on the supply chains, particularly mines and wires, right? It's mines and wires are the two things that are constraining the system and our ability to move fast. The great thing is that in the end, supply chains are highly responsive to economic incentives. We think there are ways to debottleneck globally to support and see IRA initially as really a race to the top, where the U.S. has set the bar, and this came out in Secretary Kerry's remarks here, where the U.S. has set the bar and where everyone else globally needs to rise to the challenge. So look forward to the ongoing conversation. Back to you, Jim.
Well, this is great. I had a list of 7 possible legislative ideas that the panel might have raised, and actually everybody here is talking about basically private actions and implementing the IRA and not new legislative. The only theme that came up was with Richard and John, and I think actually implicitly in your comments, Vicki, thinking about siting reform and on the transmission side being incredibly important. I mean, we know that although Richard, you're correct that the power sector is not even the largest sector of emissions, we have to build that out very substantially if we're going to decarbonize the transportation sector and, of course, steel and home and residential. So maybe I could just ask the question about siting reform. And so there's a big range, as you have indicated, on the Republican side, pushing for basically a fossil fuel siting reform drive. On the Manchin is also pretty heavily on fossil fuel, and then there's the, say, White House and others version, which is very heavily on transmission reform and giving FERC authority for interstate siting akin to its siting authority for natural gas pipelines. I think we probably can all agree that this nexus of things is really important to unlock some of the potential of the IRA. How do we get that done?
I'll just offer some general thoughts, and I'm sure my colleagues have more to say. I suspect that everybody on this panel, I know that Vicki and I have spent a good part of our career stopping things, and appropriately, not irresponsibly, not cavalierly, not thoughtlessly, but stopping things. As a former regulator, whether it was a new runway at Logan, whether it was a train system from Boston to Cape Cod, or 20 other projects that came before me. We did a lot of stopping things. And again, looking back, would I have decided a little bit more liberally? I don't know. I don't necessarily choose to completely rewrite history. But going forward, we are going to need to be a little bit more open-minded. Now, I say a little. It has to be governed by standards. You know, what's a legitimate project or what's not. The equity issues, we almost always cite things in places where people have already borne the brunt of pollution, of problems. That's got to be a non-negotiable piece of it. But I do think, just as a general matter, we're going to need to look at that. Right now, even the offshore wind industry in the state of Massachusetts is saying the amount of siting issues they have is moving them from economical to less economical. They're not yet saying non-economical, we're not going to build. We're seeing a lot of progress in the state. So I would start with the general sense that the lawyer and the ex-regulator in me has to be take a far more global and open view. But that doesn't mean no standards, because there are people who want to cite things that ought not to be cited, that are being cited in communities that have had enough sightings. And the goal here is what is the right amount of regulatory regime that we put into place? What's a legitimate rule for citing things? And how do we protect those areas, while at the same time realizing we need to make great strides in citing renewable energy and other things? And I don't have the exact answer. I'm going to wait for Vicki to answer it.
Just to build on Mindy's comments, this is a really serious challenge, and we need all of the good ideas we can muster. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab just issued a report a couple of weeks ago looking at just the queue to connect renewables to the grid, and it's gone from a few years to up to 5 years. The current sort of capacity we have in our country on the grid is about 1,250 gigawatts. We have about 2,000 gigawatts, largely clean and storage in the queue, that we can't connect to the grid. So we've got to figure this out, and we've got to figure this out with great urgency. And I think we do know how to solve these problems. We've got to talk with each other, right, and find a way in our country to listen to each other, look at some of the best ideas in the states. New York adopted a really interesting sort of approach to siting when they put in place historic investments in clean energy, and looked at sort of how do they address siting. There are other states. Illinois recently adopted some new approaches on siting. But we also need to be really, really thoughtful about if we're going to get to net zero, we're not going to get to net zero running roughshod over communities, right? Communities need to be included from the get-go. And there are some really good models in the Obama administration where, you know, one of the core principles was, you know, smart from the start. You engage communities early at the outset with great respect. I think we're making more progress in our country. There are lots of good models of that. And I think there are lots of ways we can learn from sort of those conversations. But this is an example of an issue. Like, we have these 10 years of investments in clean solutions, and we have a multi-year queue to connect clean energy to the grid. We've got to solve this with great urgency. We've got to learn how to talk with each other, look at the best ideas. And it's going to require both, you know, national scale solutions and a lot of progress at the state and local level as well.
So I'll just, I can just give folks a flavor for some of the dimensions of some of the reforms that have been proposed. So some of it relates to authority, you know, so the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and giving them clear authority over interstate transmission. Also authorities over things like what's called cost allocation, so who pays for transmission when the benefits are spread and it's, you know, hard to immediately identify, so authority around that. Time limits on permitting processes related to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, so putting time limits on things. creating what are called kind of focused agency authorities. So there's multiple different permits that might be related to a project. So having kind of single points of entry and agencies that have the lead on that, that's another dimension of the discussion. Another one is time limits on litigation, right? So one of the things that happens, so there might be a permit issued, but then there's litigation around everything, that there would be time limits on that. Some proposals for what are called categorical exclusion. So certain types of projects that are, clean, that those have an easier, pathway through the process than other projects that have emissions. So there's a number of these different dimensions. Now, one of the things that is, this is not going to be easy, unfortunately. I think you got some sense of the dimension of the legitimate concerns. I think that, also very legitimate increased concerns around community engagement and environmental justice. These tend to make things take longer. I mean, that's just the way it is, right? And so these are, it makes things more lasting and more positive in the end, but it's not necessarily the friend of speed. And so I think that there is a need for a very honest conversation about that. Because it is going to be able to have it all ways. And I do have a concern that, this may get really bogged down. Final point. We have a very split country, polarized, and permitting is one aspect of that. And so while on the one hand there would be kind of clear support for clean energy permitting and transmission and things like that, on the other side there's a roughly equal number of votes at this point that are very focused on having the same kinds of benefits for fossil energy. And so how to thread that needle while again making progress on climate is a very difficult challenge. But I think that there's one thing that I've seen is, I'll stop in a second. One thing that I've seen is there really is extreme bipartisan support for the need for permitting reform. Like, I don't know anybody who would disagree with that, but exactly what that means is very different across different stakeholder groups.
Why not thread the needle by doing both? Anyway, just 2 cents. Yeah, John.
Just one, I'm not going to comment. I think we've had authoritative responses here. I will say that there is an administrative burden that we absolutely need to process, but there's also that pull from the community in the end that we need to resolve as well. And so when we talk about solving for equity, I think there is a real equity with a dollar sign attached to it that needs to be actually carved out of these types of projects so that you move from a not in my backyard stance to a yes in my backyard, because I can actually see the community level project and dividend that is being provided directly for having the transmission lines overhead or for having the locally sited windmill or any number of other kind of assets that right now the only benefits accrue to the lessee of the land, right? And otherwise it is running roughshod over the local communities. So I think we can do a lot of innovation to create that pull that then also helps provide a little bit of lubricant to the overall permitting system itself.
That's great. Why not just open it up to the floor? My guess is that there's some people might have questions. Please. And if you could identify yourself, that would be great.
Sure.
And we're not being recorded or I hope we're not being recorded, but we're not.
I'm sure we're being recorded.
All right. Maybe we're being recorded, but we're not being webinared or whatever.
Sure. Mark Diaz at Terviva. We spoke a lot about recent legislative and policy activity. Appreciate the perspective. In the next year, the Farm Bill, one of the last great bipartisan pieces of legislation, is moving through, and it speaks to some of the issues you're related to, which is where most of our infrastructure is sited, rural communities, the potential for nature-based solutions to impact that 10% of the carbon account in ag. It historically has been one of the real sort of safe spaces in policymaking. Could any or each of you speak to considerations in the Farm Bill that you're monitoring, opportunities for carbon farming, particularly for America's ag producers, to participate in these emerging markets, and the role of rural electrification programs generally to be adapted to amplify the IRA in rural America in particular?
I'll jump in and be quick, I think. You know, agriculture is both a source and a sink with regard to carbon. And I would say to date, most of the focus, certainly policy-wide, has been on kind of positive incentives for improving the sink, for carbon storage. One of the things to keep in mind, but it's not very well defined. I mean, voluntary carbon and carbon crediting is an important element of this. I don't know if we'll talk about it during this forum, but you know, having, you know, confidence around the performance of those projects and having a kind of liquid market to incentivize so that folks can take credit for those actions is very important. One of the things that's not appreciated is the U.S. Has net accretion of carbon storage in our forest sector, but it's actually declining as our forests age. And so the benefit we're getting from forest carbon uptake is actually slowing down. And there is a lot of room for additional possibility there, but it's going to require incentives. We've done work that it doesn't require huge incentives. It's actually quite cost effective in the realm of carbon mitigation costs, but there is not actually clear policy, I would say not even close, to kind of drive carbon storage in the agriculture and forestry sectors. It's showing up. It's certainly more front and center in the Farm Bill discussion. My sense is it's not quite at the level where it's. I don't know. Maybe next time around it'll really be there. But it's certainly part of the conversation. I don't know if others.
Thank you so much for the question. It's really important, and part of ensuring that climate action benefits people's lives is ensuring that rural communities are part of that story and rural communities benefit, and the agricultural issues are hugely important. There are a number of dimensions to that. One is the terrestrial sequestration and the efforts to try to incentivize and reward those solutions. I think there are lots of coalitions that are working in exactly the way you're describing, and that is to try to figure out, is there common ground to save farmers money and to mitigate pollution, and to help farmers also be more resilient in their farming and agricultural practices. There is also an important dimension of the Inflation Reduction Act that helps ensure that those clean energy opportunities extend to rural electrification and clean energy in rural communities. And you know, there are rural co-ops that now have full access to all of those investments and incentives, and lots of examples in our country where, again, clean is going to be a way to save people money, provide healthier communities, and create real-world economic opportunities and jobs. And so, you know, we need all of that. We need it, you know, turbocharged in rural America. It's an important part of ensuring that we are closing, you know, the divide and addressing the differences in the polarization in our country, and we need to ensure that climate action benefits everyone.
Please.
Hi, I'm Laura Schifter with the Education School. Vicki, I really appreciated your comments about the community college. I think one thing the IRA leaves out, though, is a comprehensive plan for workforce development. So we have all these jobs that are going to be created, but not really the people to fill them. Is there an opportunity for policy to step in and address the workforce issues? And if it's not policy, where are we going to look for to build our workforce capacity?
Tremendous opportunities, and we've been doing some inventorying at state and local policies, and would love to compare notes with you, Laura. There are lots and lots of good ideas coming from the states on workforce training, and that's a crucial part of this. Janet McCabe talked about that a little bit too today, and some of the resources that the federal government's trying to invest in training, and we need, you know, all of those opportunities for training and education and development are just hugely important. The community college in northeastern Colorado is really, you know, comes out of, you know, a state level commitment to clean energy and ensuring that the benefits are community based, and that if you graduate from a high school in northeastern Colorado, you have an opportunity to have a good high quality job. And you know, your parents who are farmers can host wind turbines and receive a lease payment, and you can be part of kind of the 21st century. And so yes, and there are lots of models we're seeing emerge from the states, and I'd love to compare notes.
Just a quick chime in. There was a lot of work done before the Inflation Reduction Act. There was something called Build Back Better. And in that context, it was a much broader policy package, which had much more attention to things like workforce development and et cetera. And there was a lot of work done to help inform that in terms of various legislative proposals. So there's a lot of efforts there as well, too.
And I wouldn't give up on that. First of all, I think there are some parts of the Inflation Reduction Act that will necessarily foster more education. But I would be back at the Department of Education, and they often do say education budgets are real at the state level and local level, and they're not the key player. But a lot of the resources do come federally, and I would spend time at the Department of Education in Washington, as well as at the state level, looking for those opportunities. That will not cost a huge amount of money, but will create massive opportunity. So I would ride the Inflation Reduction Act, even if the exact words aren't in it. And I've seen some good ideas that we're happy to share.
Please.
John Mulligan, the Carbon Zero Project. So over the years, I think that most of you on the panel have been involved in attempts to create limits, economy-wide limits in various forms, cap and trade, pricing of carbon. Thus far we're in a world where we have a lot of carrots on the table. And yet, despite the fact that we hear from a number of folks in the vanguard today about all the great plans they're making and their commitments, I think that most would agree that we're not going to get there without some form of limits eventually. One of the things I've been struck by from the folks I know in D.C. is that it doesn't seem as though there's been a tremendous amount of corporate advocacy, direct lobbying dollars or direct advocacy devoted to limits, much more to carrots. And I wonder what prospects you all hold out for the opportunity to begin to create either sector by sector or economy-wide limits.
So I wouldn't count on anything before the election. Let's start there. I mean, there's no doubt that carbon emissions and the cost of them are no longer an externality. When something costs billions of dollars and you price it at zero, you have cockamamie, technical term, economics. You need to put a price on carbon because it costs society, business, people very real dollars. And in many parts of the world, they're doing that, some of them not high enough prices. I think we'll have to come back to that in the United States, although I will say it was clear that nobody had the appetite for it right now. So I wouldn't expect it to be discussed before the election. I do think it'll come back on the table after the election. And beyond pricing carbon, putting a price on carbon to limit the amount of carbon, we also have to do things like take away the incentives from the fossil fuel sector that have existed for 30, 40, 50 years. And we're only starting that. So there are many opportunities along the line of what you're saying that I would argue have to be done.
I would just add, and thank you so much for the question, is that the Inflation Reduction Act is a supply-side solution, and the Environmental Protection Agency is moving forward with the demand-side solution, right, and on a sectoral basis. So you're seeing, really important limits on climate and air pollution from the gigaton sectors. So on-road transportation, the standards that Administrator Regan announced to the world on April 12th that reflect the fact that in August of 2022, the whole cost structure of clean fundamentally changed, and it relies on the widespread now availability, the economic viability and technical feasibility of zero-emitting vehicles. That's 1.5 billion tons, the on-road vehicle sector. The power plant standards that will be announced in a couple of days, that's another 1.5 billion tons. The limits on oil and gas methane, again, one of the biggest, most important sources of warming today. We're getting at a lot of important reductions. And one of the pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act that has received very little attention, there was a story in the Atlantic about it and the New York Times, is that it also reinforced EPA's authority in the aftermath of the June 30th decision by the Supreme Court in West Virginia versus EPA. So EPA not only is faced with a cost structure that has changed, and that's EPA's responsibility to look at costs. Overnight, the costs have plummeted, but EPA also has reinforced legal authority And that's also important. And they are moving forward with limits on those big sectors, in addition to important protections for communities, the first ever limits on petrochemical pollution, 250 of the largest petrochemical facilities in our country that have long had cast a shadow on overburdened communities.
So, Vicki, if I understand it, what you're saying is that those limits that John was asking about are arguably coming through regulatory authority, through the Clean Air Act, and not thinking about we might have a new either a carbon tax or a clean energy standard for the power sector or anything along those lines.
And they're made ambitious, more ambitious because of the Inflation Reduction Act investments.
Yes, right.
I guess the one thing I would add to that is, and we haven't talked a lot about state-level action, is that we are seeing state-level policy that is economy-wide. In New York, California, a number of states have put in place very, globally ambitious statutory authority for net zero. And one of the things that Vicki didn't mention, but is the importance also of states in implementing, particularly the forthcoming existing power plant rules, which will be really implemented at the state level. And so there's going to need to be additional actions by states, which could be economy-wide, at least for the power sector. But again, many states are taking an economy-wide approach.
Sure, in the up top row.
Hi, Tom Polton with the Harvard School of Public Health Climate Advocacy Group. I'm just curious, you spent a lot of time talking about the impact of the IRA on technology and carbon reduction. I'm just curious, from a legislative and policy outlook, one of the important things is how voters and mindsets are changed. I'm just curious what you see in terms of the opportunities created by the IRA to change mindsets. You mentioned the investments within red states. Is that having an impact, or other types of things?
It's probably too early to tell, but I would say that is one of the most important things. And there are some on the opposition that are waiting for a Solyndra, the one bad investment of the last round, and how that became the narrative. The narrative is not whether there's one bad example or not. There are terrific examples in Indiana, in Tennessee, and other places where plants are going in. I think it's slightly too early to tell the story that we've created 200,000 jobs. I think in a year we will. But it's not too early to talk about the specifics. It's not the grand picture, but it is a specific change. And the fact that the administration, and I think it's not an accident, working with the private sector, is putting plants in red states, in places that have opposed climate change. But they don't oppose new jobs, and they don't oppose new economies within their states. And that's crucial. If somebody tries to turn back the IRA, and I assure you that will happen, having people from those red states stand up and say, I have 10,000 new jobs that have made a huge difference, and this is what it's done to my economy. So I think in many ways the transformative approach will do exactly that. Creating jobs matters, creating new solar opportunities, wind opportunities matter. We need to show it can be done and take away the skepticism.
We do a climate poll. Actually, this is planting an idea in my head. We do a climate poll every other year with Stanford, But one of the things
we can fix that.
One of the things you find very consistently, and this is across your regions, across parties, is people like clean energy. They like clean air. They don't like expensive energy. They tend to look quite favorably on the kinds of policies actually that the IRA put in place. And so there's a lot of spin, of course, and political overtones to this. I bet you if we asked a question which talked about the kind of characteristics of the kinds of things that will happen from the IRA, it would poll extremely well. If you call it the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm not sure it will. People might not know what it is, or if they've, been reading Twitter or something like that, certain people might not like it. But I think the basic principles tend to align very well with what people, and also across parties, concern about climate is actually quite high. It's been very, very stable. Anyway, I could go on, but.
Yeah, back in the back.
Hi. I have a different take that I hope you can help me with. And this is around communication from the environmental community. on getting things done more quickly, given, as I think Mindy had mentioned, the history has been to stop things, and a matter of trust. So, Vicki, when you mentioned a steel mill in Colorado, my first thought, having 3 generations of steel workers in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Lorain, and Chicago, who pre-existed before me, is why the hell is that steel mill in Colorado and not a good union steel mill in Cleveland? When you mention, I have a particular bone with RMI. A number of years ago, they did a study that showed that building energy efficient light bulbs was better for the environment building them in Shanghai than in Nella Park in Cleveland or St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. Or the one piece that was ignored that you had to really dig into that research was that the assumption was that both bulbs were being built in Shanghai. So RMI had decided that light bulbs shouldn't be built in the United States anymore. So how, rather than talking to this group of thought leaders in the East Coast, put yourself in the Harbor Inn in the Flats in Cleveland and explain why it's a good thing now to let things happen more quickly.
It's not up to me to decide whether things should happen more quickly in Cleveland. I think the opportunity should communities in Ohio decide that they want this, is that there is historic investments happening in Ohio right now in battery manufacturing, there was a White House roundtable right before the historic Senate vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, and Mary Barra was sitting in Ohio at their new manufacturing facility saying, let's go, let's build more in our country. That is happening, and it is happening, in lots and lots of red and purple states. And whether those communities, choose to accept those investments, they want those investments, that's up to them for sure. But the opportunity is one that is historic to address a manufacturing renaissance that, has left many of those communities behind for far too long. And it is a reflection of this industrial strategy, right? It is baked into the Inflation Reduction Act that one of the things we learned, during COVID is that our supply chains were brittle and exposed and inflexible, and globalization was also, leading to disenfranchisement and polarization. And so, part of what you're seeing is a shift in American policy, which is targeted, significant, historic investments that are uncapped. The other thing, these investments, there are no limits on any of these investments, right? So you're crowdsourcing in private capital with uncapped public investments that are available.
But what I'm really looking for is how do you explain that? Because you're talking about the Lordstown plant, which General Motors first shut down, put a whole lot of people out of work, then brought some of them back, some of them with union protections. I'm saying there's a trust issue between the environmental movement and the people who are voting for the people who, frankly, vote against their best interest. So how does the environmental movement message to those folks that no, we do, you've mentioned several times displaced communities. I appreciate that, I really do. But, and I live in Cambridge, so I've been out of it for a long time, where, by the way, it's almost impossible to get anything built because of zoning, which is another legislative issue. But really, I think there's a messaging issue, and I think that the environmental movement needs to address it in the industrial Midwest.
So one of the strongest supporters of the IRA in the end was the union community, organized labor. And the meetings that dozens of us were at day after day, week after week in the negotiations were environmentalists, other advocates, public health people, and the unions. I think you saw in the IRA when 40% of the IRA is focused on disadvantaged communities. If that doesn't start, and what you're saying makes sense, and is there a history of blue here and green there? Unquestionably. I think the IRA is one example, and I think there are many others, of starting to change that and bring it together. And I think just the negotiating table of passing the IRA, of having people from the inner city communities, of having labor representatives, of having environmentalists at the table, has started to reshape that in a far more effective way.
John?
Yeah, I will atone for whatever sin somebody did a long time ago at RMI here. I will say RMI specifically earmarked $250 billion for the Loan Programs Office for community transitions as part of IRA, which was essential that we think in terms of helping to transition communities impacted here. But fundamentally, what's at stake here is the next energy economy, right? And whether or not the United States wants to be relevant and leading in that. And I will say China jumped out to an early lead very quickly and is putting in, mass capacity right now and has pretty much cornered the market in about 20 different renewables technologies where it has more than 50% of global market share. And so the question now is, does Cleveland, right? Does Indianapolis, does Houston, does, in the end, Boston or San Francisco, what role do they want to play in that next energy economy? Because it's being forged now. We can see where the costs are going, and we need to get, kind of jump on board and help drive them down. And that's the calling here. Now, if states don't want to participate in that, that's fine. I would not point to it as an environmental movement issue, though. This is a global industry, a global challenge that we have, a global opportunity that we have that is fundamentally going to recreate infrastructure the world over.
We will need to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you very much. Thanks for the great questions, and I look forward to seeing you next door.